Welcome to this remarkable frontier chronicle, where forgotten wisdom and unexpected innovation collide with tradition in ways that would forever change the course of local history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time of day or night you found this story. It's always fascinating to see how far these frontier tales travel and when they reach you. In the autumn of 1963, a routine estate clearance in the high plains country of eastern Montana led to a discovery that would puzzle military historians, frontier researchers, and ballistics experts for the better part of a decade. The item in question was a Winchester Model 1873 rifle, unremarkable in appearance, found among the effects of a deceased rancher whose property had been in the same family since territorial days. The rifle itself showed the expected wear of frontier use, stock darkened by decades of handling, barrel pitted from moisture and neglect, the lever mechanism stiff but functional. What made this particular firearm extraordinary was discovered only when a cataloger at the Historical Society attempted to clean the barrel and found the bore partially obstructed by something that should not have been there. Inside the rifle's barrel, compressed into a cylinder barely 3/4 of an inch in diameter, was a tightly rolled manuscript. The pages, when carefully extracted and humidified over the course of 3 months, revealed themselves to be ledger paper, covered in minute handwriting. The text documented not a tale of gunfights or cattle drives, but rather a meticulous record of water sources, seasonal weather patterns, and survival calculations spanning a 15-year period in the Montana-Wyoming borderlands during the 1880s and 1890s. The author identified himself only as E.K., formerly of the 7th Infantry, and the opening line read, "If you are reading this, then either I have perished without passing this knowledge forward, or you have discovered what others called my madness was in fact my salvation." The manuscript would eventually be traced to a man named Ezekiel Kincaid, a veteran of the last organized cavalry operations against resistant tribal groups in the region, who had mustered out in 1881 and taken up a homestead claim near the confluence of the Powder River and a seasonal tributary known locally as Alkali Creek. Land Office records showed Kincaid's claim as one of the more remote filings in that district, situated nearly 18 miles from the nearest established settlement of Broadus, with no neighbors within 5 miles in any direction. The claim itself encompassed a quarter section of mixed grassland and coulees, marginal country that more experienced settlers had passed over in favor of bottomland, closer to the Yellowstone River drainage. Contemporary accounts suggest Kincaid's choice was met with puzzlement bordering on derision among the established ranching community. What made Kincaid's situation noteworthy to his contemporaries was not the isolation, which was common enough on the frontier, but rather the manner in which he approached his homesteading effort. While neighboring operations focused on maximizing cattle numbers and rapid expansion, Kincaid spent his first 2 years engaged in what appeared to be excessive and obsessive preparation. Land Office testimony from 1883 notes that Kincaid constructed not 1, but 3 separate dugout shelters on his property, each positioned in different drainage patterns and elevations. He excavated 2 wells to a depth of 43 feet, far deeper than the regional standard of 20 to 25 feet, and lined both with fitted stone rather than the more economical timber cribbing. His above-ground structures included a main cabin with double walls filled with packed earth, a root cellar extended 12 feet below frost line, and a workshop building featuring a chimney system that drew from 3 separate flues. The extent of these preparations drew comment in the Broadus Weekly Courier, which in the spring of 1884 published a brief item noting that the Kincaid homestead presents the appearance of a man preparing for a siege rather than engaging in the cattle trade. The article, written with the casual dismissiveness characteristic of frontier journalism, went on to suggest that Kincaid's military service had perhaps left him overly cautious in circumstances that required decisiveness and commercial acumen. Other settlers in the region were more blunt in their assessments. A deposition taken years later for an unrelated land dispute includes second-hand testimony that Kincaid was regarded as peculiar in his habits and wasteful in his labors, building structures fit for a fortress when a simple-lined cabin would suffice. More. For nearly 3 years, this pattern continued. Kincaid maintained a small herd of cattle, no more than 40 head at any given time, while neighboring operations ran herds of 200 or more. He kept detailed records of precipitation, wind patterns, and temperature variations, annotations that would later be found not only in the rifle manuscript, but also in a series of ledgers discovered in a sealed tin box buried beneath the floor of his root cellar. These ledgers documented water table fluctuations, noting the depth to water in his wells on a weekly basis throughout the year. He recorded the dates of first and last frost with precision, tracked the flowering times of native grasses, and maintained counts of antelope and elk movements through different sections of his range during various seasons. To his neighbors, this appeared to be the behavior of a man who had mistaken accounting for ranching, paperwork for practical labor. The trigger event that would vindicate Kincaid's preparations and expose the vulnerability of more conventional approaches arrived in the form of meteorological conditions that developed during the autumn of 1886. September of that year had been unusually warm and dry across the northern plains, with temperatures remaining above seasonal averages well into October. Cattle operations expanded their herds based on the mild conditions, and several ranchers in the Broadus area increased their winter holdings in anticipation of favorable prices in the spring markets. The regional consensus, reflected in contemporary newspaper accounts, was that the winter would be open and manageable, requiring minimal supplemental feeding and allowing cattle to continue grazing through much of the cold season. The first snow arrived on November 16, 1886, earlier than expected, but not alarming in itself. What followed, however, was a weather pattern that would be documented in meteorological records as one of the most severe climatic events in the recorded history of the American West. Temperatures dropped precipitously, with readings at Fort Keogh, roughly 60 miles north, recording sustained periods below negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit. More critically, the snowfall continued with unusual persistence, accumulating to depths that made conventional winter grazing impossible. By early December, snow depths across the region averaged 3 to 4 feet on level ground, with drifts in coulees and valleys measuring 10 feet or more. What made the winter of 1886-1887 particularly devastating was not merely the cold or snow depth, but the sequence of weather events that followed. A brief warming period in late December created a surface crust on the snow, which then froze solid when temperatures plummeted again, creating a barrier that cattle could not break through to reach the dried grasses beneath. This was followed by additional snowfall and a series of blizzards that continued into January and February. Wind speeds during these storms were estimated to exceed 40 miles per hour for extended periods, creating whiteout conditions and driving snow into every structure, corral, and sheltered area across the plains. The immediate response among the ranching community was one of collective denial, followed by improvised crisis management. Initial assessments dismissed the severity of the conditions, with several prominent stockmen insisting that the weather would break and normal grazing conditions would resume. When it became clear that the winter would not relent, efforts shifted to emergency feeding programs, but these were hampered by several critical factors. Hay supplies, which had seemed adequate for a typical winter, proved grossly insufficient for the extended period of deep snow. Transportation of additional feed became impossible as roads drifted closed and remained impassable for weeks at a time. The railroad line that served Broadus experienced repeated blockages, with some sections remaining snowbound for the entire month of January 1887. Water access became an equally critical issue. Many ranchers had relied on creek and river access for their cattle, but these water sources either froze solid or became inaccessible due to snow accumulation. Wells that had been adequate during normal conditions proved too shallow, with water tables dropping as the ground froze to unusual depths. The standard well depth of 20 to 25 feet, which served adequately in typical winters, proved insufficient when frost penetration exceeded 30 feet in some locations. Ranchers found themselves unable to water their herds, facing the grim irony of cattle dying of thirst while surrounded by frozen water in the form of snow and ice. The human cost of the winter manifested not in dramatic individual tragedies, but in the slow accumulation of privation and exhaustion. Ranch hands worked around the clock attempting to break trail to cattle, haul emergency feed supplies, and maintain access to any functioning water sources. Frostbite cases became endemic, with several individuals losing fingers or toes to cold exposure. Food supplies in isolated homesteads dwindled as resupply became impossible. The mail route from Miles City to Broadus, which typically operated on a weekly schedule, ceased entirely for a 6-week period between mid-January and early March. Communication between ranches, which relied on riders traveling established trails, became sporadic and then impossible, as even the most experienced riders refused to venture out in conditions where visibility could drop to zero without warning, and temperatures could kill an exposed person within hours. Contemporary accounts from those who survived the winter describe a landscape transformed into something alien and hostile. The Broadus Weekly Courier, which resumed publication in March 1887, after a 2-month suspension, published eyewitness descriptions of cattle frozen standing upright, having died where they stood when they could no longer generate sufficient body heat to survive. Herds that had numbered in the hundreds were reduced to handfuls of survivors. Ranches that had appeared prosperous and well established in the autumn found themselves in financial ruin by spring, their cattle dead, their feed exhausted, their credit extended beyond recovery. The spring count, when it could finally be conducted after the snowmelt, revealed losses that ranged from 60 to 90% across most operations in the region. Against this backdrop of widespread catastrophe, Ezekiel Kincaid's homestead presented an anomaly that few were willing to discuss openly. Kincaid's cattle, never numerous to begin with, survived the winter at a rate exceeding 90%. His water sources remained functional throughout the coldest months due to the depth of his wells, which reached below the frost line, even during the most severe cold. His multiple shelter structures allowed him to rotate cattle into protected areas during the worst blizzards, preventing the kind of exposure deaths that decimated other herds. His documented hay supplies, which had seemed excessive when calculated against his small herd, proved exactly adequate for the extended feeding period that the winter required. He himself never appeared in town seeking supplies or assistance, having provisioned himself in the preceding autumn with quantities of flour, salt, coffee, and other staples that his neighbors had considered wasteful hoarding. The discovery of Kincaid's successful navigation of the winter did not generate admiration or inquiry, but rather a more complex response combining embarrassment, resentment, and strategic silence. No newspaper account from 1887 mentioned Kincaid's success. No neighboring rancher sought his advice on reconstruction efforts. The few documented interactions from that period suggest a community that found it easier to dismiss Kincaid's survival as luck, rather than acknowledge it as the result of preparation that they themselves had mocked. A letter found in the archives of the Montana Historical Society, written by a Broadus merchant to a supplier in Miles City, includes the aside. The Kincaid fellow came through well enough, but then he was barely running cattle to begin with, so his situation hardly compares to those who were operating at proper scale. What the historical record shows, through the careful reconstruction of events from multiple fragmentary sources, is that several ranchers did in fact approach Kincaid in the months following the winter. These interactions, documented through later testimony and correspondence, were not recorded publicly, but took place privately, often at Kincaid's homestead rather than in town. The nature of these visits was practical. Requests for information on well drilling techniques, questions about fodder calculation, inquiries into the design of his double-walled structures. Kincaid's responses, as described in second-hand accounts, were factual and detailed, offering specific measurements, construction methods, and resource calculations without either judgment or self-promotion. One such visit, mentioned in a probate deposition filed in 1903, involved a rancher named Hiram Ludlow, whose operation had lost an estimated 70% of its cattle during the winter. Ludlow reportedly spent 3 days at Kincaid's homestead in May 1887, during which Kincaid showed him the water table documentation in his ledgers, the depth and lining method of his wells, and the calculations he had used to determine hay requirements. The deposition notes that Ludlow subsequently redesigned his entire ranch water system, drilling new wells to depths exceeding 40 feet, and constructing covered livestock shelters based on Kincaid's designs. However, when asked publicly about his recovery strategy, Ludlow attributed his decisions to consultation with engineers from the East, rather than acknowledging local sources of expertise. The manuscript found in Kincaid's rifle contained not merely historical observations, but specific technical guidance presented in a format suggesting the author understood he might not be present to explain his methods in person. The document included well drilling specifications noting that in this region, security of water requires depth beyond 40 feet, with stone lining essential to prevent collapse during extended frost. Leatt detailed hay calculations based on a winter of 4 months full feeding rather than the 2 months that conventional wisdom suggests, with specific tonnage requirements per head of cattle. The manuscript documented wind patterns and their relationship to snow accumulation, noting that shelters positioned on eastern slopes face drifting that renders them inaccessible, while western slope locations maintain clearer access during typical storm patterns from the northwest. Perhaps most significantly, the manuscript included what can only be described as a frontier survival philosophy expressed in characteristically terse language. The prepared man appears foolish to his neighbors until the day he does not. That day arrives without warning and without mercy. The question is not whether hardship will come, but whether you will be standing when it passes. These observations were accompanied by detailed calculations of resource needs for extended periods without resupply, temperature thresholds for various construction materials, and seasonal timing for preparatory work. The manuscript concluded with instructions for concealment. This knowledge is hidden not for secrecy, but for preservation. Paper weathers and burns. Metal locks rust. The barrel of a working tool survives both time and circumstance. The question of why Kincaid chose to conceal his knowledge in such an unusual location becomes clearer when examined through the lens of frontier social dynamics and his own documented experiences. Additional materials found at his homestead, including personal correspondence and journal entries, reveal a man who had attempted multiple times to share his observations and recommendations through conventional channels. A letter dated October 1885, addressed to the Montana Stock Growers Association, offered detailed weather pattern analysis and suggested preparatory measures for what Kincaid described as conditions that historical precedent suggests arrive approximately every 20 years. Rio. The letter received no formal response and no publication in the association's quarterly bulletin. Similarly, attempts to present his findings to local ranchers met with dismissal. A journal entry from November 1885 records spoke with Malachi Stringer regarding well depth and winter provisioning. He assured me that the mild pattern of recent years would continue and that my concerns reflected inexperience with local conditions. Noted that I should attend to my own small operation rather than presuming to advise established cattlemen. This pattern of rejection appears to have led Kincaid to conclude that his knowledge would be dismissed during his lifetime, but might prove valuable to future homesteaders who could examine his methods without the interference of contemporary prejudice. The winter of 1886 to 1887 effectively ended the first phase of large-scale cattle ranching in the Montana-Wyoming borderlands. The losses were so severe that the economic structure of the region underwent fundamental transformation. Many large operators, particularly those backed by Eastern or European capital, withdrew entirely from the region. Those who remained adopted significantly more conservative stocking rates and invested in infrastructure that previous generations had considered unnecessary expense. Deeper wells, weather-tight shelters, expanded hay production, and diversified feed sources. These changes, while never explicitly attributed to Kincaid's example, reflected principles that were virtually identical to those he had documented years earlier. Kincaid himself continued his homesteading operation until his death in 1911, never significantly expanding his cattle numbers, but maintaining a small, sustainable operation that survived subsequent weather events with minimal losses. His estate, when inventoried for probate, showed modest assets but zero debt, a notable distinction in an era when most ranchers operated under permanent obligation to creditors. The inventory included the rifle containing the manuscript listed simply as Winchester Rifle, condition fair, valued at $8. The rifle and most of Kincaid's effects were purchased by a nephew who maintained them without examination until his own death in 1962, at which point they entered the estate clearance process that led to the manuscript's discovery. The investigation that followed the manuscript's discovery in 1963 was conducted primarily by a graduate researcher named Vernon Albright, who was completing a dissertation on frontier adaptation strategies at the University of Montana. Albright spent nearly 2 years tracking down surviving records related to Kincaid's homestead, interviewing descendants of neighboring ranchers, and correlating the manuscript's technical recommendations with actual practices that had been adopted in the region following the catastrophic winter. His research, published in 1967 as a monograph titled Preparation and Survival Water Management Strategies in Montana Cattle Country, 1880-1900, Wise provided the first comprehensive analysis of how Kincaid's methods had influenced regional practices, despite never receiving public acknowledgement. Albright's research uncovered several instances where Kincaid's technical innovations had been adopted by neighboring operations without attribution. Well depths in the Broadus area increased dramatically after 1887, with drilling records showing an average depth of 42 feet for wells constructed between 1888 and 1895, compared to an average of 23 feet for wells drilled before 1886. Hay storage calculations changed, with recommended stockpiling increasing from 2 months of feed to 4 months. Shelter construction evolved to include double wall designs and improved wind protection, precisely matching specifications found in Kincaid's manuscript. Yet in the agricultural extension bulletins, ranching journals, and Cattlemen's Association publications from this period, these innovations were presented as the result of modern scientific methods and expert consultation, with no mention of their actual source. One particularly revealing document uncovered by Albright was a report prepared in 1892 by a surveyor named Josiah Whitmore, who had been engaged to assess ranch improvements for loan qualification purposes. Whitmore's report on the Ludlow Ranch, the same operation whose owner had spent 3 days at Kincaid's homestead, described in detail the well system, hay storage facilities, and livestock shelters that Ludlow had constructed. The report noted these improvements as innovative adaptations reflecting progressive management, and made no reference to Kincaid, despite the fact that the specifications matched his designs exactly. Whitmore, when interviewed by Albright in 1965, admitted that he had been aware of Kincaid's role, but explained that Ludlow made it clear he preferred not to have certain consultations documented for business reasons. The manuscript itself, beyond its technical content, provided insight into Kincaid's understanding of his own position within frontier society. Several passages addressed future readers directly, anticipating skepticism. You who read this may question whether such preparations are excessive. Consider that the man who appears foolish for overbuilding is remembered as wise when his structures stand while others fall. The cost of excess preparation is measured in unused materials and expended labor. The cost of insufficient preparation is measured in survival itself. These observations suggest that Kincaid was acutely aware of how his methods were perceived and had made conscious decisions about how to respond to that perception. Another passage addressed the question of why he had not simply published his findings or sought wider dissemination. I have attempted to share these observations through conventional means and found no welcome for them. The printed word reaches only those who are inclined to read it, and those so inclined have already determined what they believe to be true. This record serves a different purpose. It documents what worked for those who come after and find themselves in circumstances that require answers rather than assumptions. This statement reveals a sophisticated understanding of how knowledge is transmitted on the frontier, recognizing that practical demonstration and personal experience often carry more weight than written authority. The technical content of the manuscript has been analyzed by multiple experts in the decades since its discovery, and the consensus assessment is that Kincaid's methods represented sound engineering adapted to specific environmental conditions. A 1972 study by the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology examined his well depth recommendations and confirmed that his calculation of 43 feet as the minimum depth for reliable year-round water access was accurate for the geological and climatic conditions of the Powder River country. His hay storage calculations, when reviewed by agricultural historians, proved to be based on accurate assessments of caloric needs and forage quality degradation over time. Even his architectural specifications for double-walled structures have been recognized as effective approaches to thermal management in high-altitude, high-wind environments. What emerges from this analysis is not a story of supernatural prescience or luck, but rather of systematic observation, careful calculation, and willingness to invest labor in preparation that might appear unnecessary during favorable conditions. Kincaid's advantage over his neighbors was not access to secret knowledge or exceptional resources, but simply the recognition that frontier survival depended on planning for the worst-case scenario rather than the most likely one. His methods required more initial labor and appeared less efficient during normal years, but proved decisive during the catastrophic winter that eventually arrived. The historical record provides no indication that Kincaid experienced vindication or recognition during his lifetime. Newspaper accounts from Broadus make no mention of him after 1887, except for standard legal notices related to his homestead claim and livestock brands. The Montana Stock Growers Association archives contain no correspondence from him after his initial letter in 1885. His estate inventory suggests comfortable but not prosperous circumstances, with assets typical of a small-scale homesteader who had maintained operations for 3 decades without expansion or debt. He appears to have lived exactly as he began, independently, quietly, and according to principles that he had determined through observation and experience, rather than conventional wisdom. The fate of Kincaid's knowledge offers a case study in how practical innovation diffuses through frontier communities despite social resistance to acknowledging its source. The technical methods he developed were adopted widely, but their origin was systematically obscured. This pattern reflects the complex social dynamics of frontier settlements, where established hierarchies and commercial relationships often took precedence over simple acknowledgement of effective practice. Those who consulted Kincaid found value in his expertise, but faced social and economic incentives to attribute their improvements to other sources. The result was a kind of amnesia regarding the origins of practical innovation, allowing the community to adopt better methods while maintaining existing social structures. The manuscript's concealment in the rifle barrel can be understood as Kincaid's response to this dynamic. Recognizing that his knowledge would not be acknowledged during his lifetime, he preserved it in a form that might survive to serve future homesteaders who could evaluate his methods based on results rather than reputation. The choice of concealment location was itself characteristic of his approach. Practical, durable, and unlikely to be destroyed by fire, water, or simple neglect. A working rifle, even one relegated to storage, tends to be preserved by families as a valuable tool or heirloom. Paper stored in drawers or boxes, weathers, and molds. Documents filed in official records may be lost or destroyed, but a rifle, even if unused, retains sufficient value that it will likely be kept and eventually examined. The broader implications of the Kincaid case extend beyond individual frontier survival to questions of how communities learn from catastrophic events. The winter of 1886–1887 provided clear evidence that established ranching practices were inadequate for the region's climatic extremes. Yet the community response was not to seek out and systematically study the few operations that had succeeded, but rather to adopt similar methods while attributing them to external expertise. This pattern suggests that learning from catastrophe is often hindered by social factors that have nothing to do with the quality or availability of effective information. The man who had successfully prepared for disaster was ignored before it arrived and quietly copied after it passed, receiving neither credit nor compensation for knowledge that likely saved multiple operations from complete failure. Vernon Albright's research concluded with observations about the nature of frontier expertise and its transmission. The historical record consistently demonstrates that practical knowledge on the frontier was generated through direct observation and accumulated experience, yet was frequently dismissed when it originated from sources outside established hierarchies of authority. Kincaid's case illustrates how effective methods could exist within a community, be demonstrated through successful application, and yet remain unacknowledged because their source lacked the social standing to claim authorship. The manuscript in the rifle represents not just a technical manual, but a commentary on the social barriers to practical learning in frontier contexts. The manuscript itself, after extensive analysis and documentation, was archived by the Montana Historical Society in 1969. It remains part of their permanent collection, catalog number R1963-847, available for research by appointment. The rifle that contained it was returned to Kincaid's surviving relatives, who eventually donated it to a small museum in Broadus, where it is displayed with a placard explaining its historical significance. The exhibit notes that the rifle contained a manuscript documenting early water management and survival techniques, but the full text of the manuscript is not reproduced, nor are the specific details of Kincaid's interactions with his neighbors. The museum's interpretation focuses on the ingenuity of concealing the manuscript in an unusual location, treating it primarily as a curiosity, rather than engaging with the more complex questions of why such concealment was necessary. The final assessment that emerges from the Kincaid case concerns the nature of preparation and its perception in communities that value action over caution. Frontier society, particularly in its early phases, tended to reward rapid expansion, visible confidence, and commitment to growth-oriented strategies. The prudent homesteader who invested in redundant systems, excessive capacity, and preparation for unlikely but severe contingencies appeared to be misallocating resources that could otherwise drive expansion. This perception held firm until the moment when those preparations proved decisive, at which point the community faced a choice: acknowledge that its previous assessments had been wrong, or find ways to adopt better practices while maintaining previous social hierarchies. The historical record suggests that the second option was far more common. Kincaid's legacy, such as it is, exists primarily in the physical infrastructure of the region rather than in documented acknowledgement. The well depths, shelter designs, and resource calculations that he demonstrated became standard practice, absorbed into the common knowledge of the area without attribution to their source. This represents a form of success in that his methods achieved widespread adoption, but also a form of erasure in that the principles behind those methods and the reasoning that generated them were lost in the process of adoption. Future generations inherited the practices, but not the understanding of how and why they had developed, making them vulnerable to abandoning those practices if conditions appeared to have changed. The manuscript's final passages addressed this concern directly. Those who adopt these methods without understanding their foundation may abandon them when years pass without crisis, believing that preparation was excessive because disaster did not arrive. The prepared position appears wasteful only to those who have not yet faced what preparation was meant to survive. When disaster comes, it will not announce itself in advance or wait for you to ready yourself. The time to prepare is always before you believe you need to, and the depth of preparation must account for the worst you can imagine, not merely the worst you have experienced. Hier bureau,